As the first light of dawn breaks over the rugged Montana hillside, a sight unfolds that will leave an entire community speechless. A wild Mustang Mare stands guard over a sleeping child, her powerful body positioned between the boy and approaching rescuers. She simply refuses to leave his side. 8-year-old Henry Patterson, a nonverbal child with autism, who wandered away from a community fair, has survived a night in the wilderness that should have claimed his life. The Mustang, a creature known for avoiding humans at all costs, has inexplicably protected him through the night, keeping predators at bay and shielding him from the bitter cold. No one can explain the mare's behavior until veterinarian Dr. Julia Winters recognizes the distinctive star marking on the horse's forehead and pieces together an extraordinary connection from years earlier that will challenge everything they thought they knew about animals' memory and the debts of gratitude that can span species and time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the remarkable story of Sierra the Mustang Mare, who remembered a kindness when it mattered most, and the child whose silent connection would one day save them both. What unfolds over the next 24 hours will touch hearts, heal old wounds, and remind us all that some bonds transcend understanding, bonds that can never be broken. No matter how many years or miles come between, the morning sun cast long shadows across Redwood Creek's community fairgrounds. As Emily Patterson scanned the crowd for what felt like the 800th time, the familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her chest as she clutched her son's blue jacket. Henry, she called, though she knew he wouldn't answer even if he heard her. Her voice joined the chorus of other searchers calling his name. Michael Patterson pushed through a group of concerned neighbors, his weathered face tight with worry. Any sign? Emily shook her head, fighting the tremor in her voice. He was just here watching the pony rides. I looked away for maybe 30 seconds to sign, knew that form for his school, and her voice caught. Michael placed a steady hand on her shoulder. We'll find him. Sheriff Dawson has already called in extra deputies. The fairgrounds had transformed from a place of celebration to the center of a growing crisis. Volunteers moved in organized groups, checking every booth, tent, and corner. Henry had been missing for over 2 hours now, and the community of Redwood Creek had mobilized quickly. Sheriff Roy Dawson, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and lines etched deep around his eyes, approached the peasants with his radio in, and we've covered the entire fairground and half-mile perimeter. No sign of him yet. He hesitated. We need to consider that he might have wandered toward the forest edge or creek. A cold fist of fear gripped Emily's heart. Red Creek wasn't just the name of their town, it was a real waterway that cut through the valley before winding into the densely forested mountains. Beyond, he's drawn to water. Michael said, his voice hollow, in animals, especially horses. He spent all morning at the pony exhibit. I'm calling in search and rescue, Sheriff Dawson said, and I'd like your permission to contact Dr. Winters if Henry's heading for wild country. Yes, Emily said immediately. Eula knows the terrain and she knows Henry within the hour. The small fairground parking lot had become a command center. Trucks with horse trailers arrived. Volunteers checked in with Maria Reynolds. The county's search and rescue coordinator. Dogs sniffed Henry's jacket while their handlers studied maps. Michael stood at the edge of the gathering, his eyes fixed on the tree line where the manicured fairgrounds gave way to wilderness. He's out there, he said when Emily joined him. I can feel it. Emily squeezed his hand. He's smarter than people give him credit for. That's what worries me. Michael replied. He doesn't think like we do. He might not even realize he's lost. A silver pickup truck pulled into the lot, and Dr. Julia Winters stepped out dressed in worn jeans and hiking boots. The veterinarian moved with purpose, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She greeted the Pattersons with a tight hug. I came as soon as I heard, she said. How long has he been gone? Almost 3 hours now, Emily answered. Julia nodded, her expression grave but determined. I brought maps of the back country. There are a few water sources he might have headed toward. Sheriff Dawson joined them with several deputies, and Maria Reynolds were organizing teams for different sectors, he explained, spreading a map on the hood of his cruiser. The helicopter from county will be here within the hour, but we can't wait. With night coming and the temperature dropping, no one needed him to finish the sentence. Nighttime in Montana's wilderness was no place for anyone, let alone an 8-year-old boy who couldn't call for help. Henry has a special connection with animals. Julia informed the search team if he encounters wildlife, he's more likely to approach than run. That's both a blessing and a curse out there. The teams dispersed with radios and coordinates, the Pattersons joining different groups to cover more ground. As Julia prepared to head out with her team, the crackle of the sheriff's radio drew everyone's attention. "Sheriff, this is Hank Wilson up on Eagle Ridge Road. I'm tracking something strange about 4 miles northeast of the fairgrounds." The voice paused. "There's a wild Mustang Mare acting unusual near Broken Pine Canyon. She's pacing back and forth like she's guarding something." The sheriff exchanged glances with Julia. "That's pretty far for a child to wander," he said cautiously. "Henry's determined when he sets his mind to something." Michael interjected, "And if there were horses," the radio crackled again. "Sheriff, my wife's got the binoculars on her. Now the mayor is not alone. There's something small at the base of that rock formation, could be a person." Julia was already heading for her truck. "I know that area. The wild herds don't usually come that close to the road unless something's wrong. All available units redirect to Broken Pine Canyon," the sheriff commanded. Into his radio, "Approach with caution. If there's a wild horse involved, keep your distance until Dr. Winters arrives." Michael climbed into Julia's truck without asking permission. She didn't object. The drive was tense, the rutted dirt road slowing their progress as it wound up into increasingly rough terrain behind them. A small convoy of vehicles followed sheriff's deputies, search and rescue volunteers, and Emily in another truck. "Henry's always been drawn to horses," Michael said, breaking the heavy silence since he was tiny. "Remember when?" Julia nodded, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I remember." The road narrowed as they approached a ridge that overlooked a small canyon. Hank Wilson's pickup was parked at the side, and he flagged them down, pointing toward a rock formation about a 100-yard below them. "Down there," he said as they pulled alongside. "My wife's keeping an eye with the binoculars. The horse hasn't moved, just stands there watching the road like she's expecting us." Julia grabbed her field glasses from the glove compartment and focused on the spot. Hank indicated, her breath caught. "It's Henry," she confirmed, passing the binoculars to Michael. Through the lenses, he could see his son sitting on the ground at the base of a large rock formation. Next to him, standing in a clearly protective stance, was a chestnut Mustang Mare. Even from this distance, the white star marking on her forehead was visible. "That's him," Michael choked out. "But what's with the horse? Why isn't she running off more?" Vehicles arrived, creating a small traffic jam on the narrow road. Emily rushed to Michael's side, grabbing the binoculars. "He looks okay," she whispered. "He's not moving much, but he's sitting up." Sheriff Dwan joined them. "How do we approach this? That's a wild animal guarding him." Julia studied the scene carefully. Not guarding, protecting. Look at her body language. She's positioned herself between Henry and what she perceives as potential threats. Is it normal behavior for a wild Mustang?" the sheriff asked. Julia shook her head slowly. "No, it's unprecedented. Mustangs typically avoid human contact at all costs. Maybe it's not entirely wild," someone suggested. "No," Julia said, still watching through her binoculars. "That's definitely one of the wild ones. I recognize her from the Thunder Basin herd." She lowered the glasses slowly. A strange expression crossed her face. "Wait a minute, that star marking, what is it?" Emily asked, sensing something in Julia's tone. "I need to get closer," Julia said, avoiding the question. "Sheriff, I need your men to stay back." "Michael, you can come with me." But we approached slowly and quietly. No sudden movements. They picked their way carefully down the rocky slope. As they drew closer, the mare raised her head, ears forward. Alert, but not showing signs of bolting. Henry sat cross-legged on the ground, rocking slightly. His self-soothing motion. He appeared physically unharmed. "Henry," Michael called softly when they were about 50 feet away. "It's Dad." The boy didn't look up or acknowledge the voice, but the Mustang's ears flicked toward the sound. She shifted position, slightly moving closer to Henry in what could only be described as a protective gesture. Julia stopped, putting a hand on Michael's arm to halt him as well. "That's close enough for now," she whispered. "Look at her, she's not afraid. But she's not letting us approach either. We can't just leave him there." Michael whispered back urgently. "We won't," Julia assured him. "But we need to understand what's happening here. This isn't normal behavior." As they stood watching, Henry finally looked up. He didn't make eye contact with his father-mother, but his hand reached out to touch the mare's leg. The wild horse, instead of startling, lowered her head until her muzzle was near the boy's face. Henry didn't smile, he rarely did, but his body relaxed visibly at the contact. "My God," Michael breathed. "She's comforting him." Julia stared at the scene, her professional detachment faltering. "Michael," she said quietly, "I think I know this horse." Michael turned. To her in confusion, how could you possibly? The star marking on her forehead. Julia continued, her voice growing more certain, and that small scar on her left hind leg. I think this is the same foal we treated 4 years ago, the one Henry bonded." With Michael looked back at the mare in disbelief. "That's impossible. We released her back to the wild. She couldn't possibly remember." Julia interrupted. "They found her injured by the creek, not far from your property. You called me, and we treated her in your barn for almost 2 weeks. Henry spent hours with her every day." Understanding dawned slowly on Michael's face. "Sierra," he whispered. Henry named her Sierra. Julia nodded, and now somehow she's found him, or he found her, either way. She remembers. Above them on the ridge, Sheriff Dawson's voice came through on the radio. "What's the situation down there?" Julia raised her radio. "We need more time. The Mustang is protecting Henry, not threatening him. I believe there's a prior connection." "A prior connection with a wild horse?" The sheriff's voice couldn't hide his skepticism. "It's complicated," Julia replied, "but I think I know how to handle this. Tell everyone to stay back and keep noise to a minimum." She turned to Michael. "I need to try something. Stay here slowly, deliberately." Julia took a few steps forward, then stopped. She made a soft clicking sound with her tongue, the same sound she taught Henry to use with the injured foe years ago. The mare's head came up sharply, ears pricked forward. Julia repeated the sound. The Mustang's nostrils flared as she scented the air. Then, to Michael's amazement, the horse took a tentative step toward Julia, then another, though she kept glancing back at Henry. "Sierra." Julia called softly, "Remember me, girl." The mare stopped, her head high. Muscles tense for a long moment, everything was still. Then Sierra nickered, a soft, questioning sound. "That's it," Julia encouraged. "You remember, don't you? You're Sierra." Henry looked up at the sound of the name, his eyes not quite focusing on Julia, but definitely responding to the word. He made a humming sound, the closest he usually came to speech, and patted the ground beside him. Sierra hesitated, caught between approaching Julia and staying with Henry, though Mare's behavior was extraordinary, torn between recognition of Julia and her apparent commitment to stay with the child. "It's okay," Julia said. "We're all friends here." She slowly reached into her pocket and produced a small apple, a habit from her veterinary visits to farms. She held it out in her palm. Sierra's ears flicked forward with interest. She looked from Julia to Henry and back again. Then, with careful, deliberate steps, she approached Julia, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. "That's right," Julia murmured. "You do remember." As Sierra stretched her neck to take the apple from Julia's, and Michael seized the opportunity to move quickly to Henry's side. The boy didn't resist when his father knelt beside him, checking him for injuries. "He seems okay," Michael called softly to Julia. "Cold, maybe a little dehydrated, but no injuries I can see." Julia nodded, still maintaining eye contact with Sierra as the mare finished the apple. "I think she's been with him all night," she said, "keeping him warm, keeping predators away." "But how did she even find him?" Michael asked, wrapping his jacket around Henry's shoulders. "How could she know he needed help?" Julia shook her head in wonder. "I don't know. But horses remember. They remember kindness, and they remember cruelty." Henry showed her nothing but gentleness when she was at her most vulnerable above them. Emily could wait no longer. She was making her way carefully down the slope, followed at a distance by Sheriff Dawson and a paramedic. Sierra tensed at the approach of more humans, backing up several steps. Julia kept her voice calm and steady. "It's okay, Sierra, they're friends too." Emily reached her son and husband, dropping to her knees and gathering Henry into a tight embrace. "You're okay," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "You're okay?" Henry allowed the hug but kept his gaze fixed on Sierra, one hand reaching out toward the May. Sierra watched them cautiously, but didn't flee. I don't understand, Emily said, looking from Henry to the wild Mustang. Why didn't she run away? Why did she stay with him? Julia smiled, a look of wonder still on her face. That's Sierra, Emily the foe. We rescued 4 years ago. Somehow she recognized Henry, and when he needed help, she remembered the kindness he showed her, and Emily stared at the mayor in disbelief, then back at her son. But that's, I know, Julia said, it's remarkable. In all my years working with animals, I've never seen anything like it. The sheriff approached cautiously the boy. Okay, he asked in a low voice. Michael nodded. Yes, thanks to her. He indicated Sierra, who had backed up further but still hadn't fled. She protected him all night. Sheriff Dawson shook his head in amazement. I've seen a lot of strange things in these mountains, but never anything like this. How do we get him back up to the road carefully? Julia advised Sierra stayed this long, but she's still a wild horse, too many people, too much noise, and she'll bolt as they prepared to carry Henry back. Up the slope, the boy suddenly made a distressed sound, pulling away from his mother and taking a step toward Sierra. The mare responded immediately, moving closer, despite her obvious weariness of the growing number of humans' weight. Julia said, Latoon, give them a moment. Henry stood before the wild Mustang, his small hand extended. Sierra lowered her head until her muzzle touched his palm for a brief moment. They connected, the nonverbal boy and the wild mare, in a form of communication more profound than words. Then, Henry turned and walked back to his parents, allowing them to lead him toward the path up the ridge. Sierra watched them go, her powerful body statue still, except for the occasional flick of her tail, as the rescue party made their slow way up the rocky slope. Julia lingered, her eyes on the remarkable Mustang who had defied all natural instincts to protect a vulnerable child. Thank you, she said softly. Sierra's ears twitched forward at the sound. Then, with a toss of her head, she turned and cantered away, disappearing into the shelter of the canyon walls. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a Meister that would challenge everything the people of Redwood Creek thought they knew about the wild Mustangs that shared their land, and about the silent child who had formed an unbreakable bond with one of them. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The small examination room at Redwood Creek's medical clinic buzzed with activity as Dr. Martin checked Henry's vitals. The boy sat quietly on the paper-covered table, his gaze fixed on the window rather than on the people. Discussing him outside, a small crowd had gathered, volunteers from the search neighbors and curious townsfolk drawn by the extraordinary story that was already spreading through the community. Apart from mild dehydration and some scrapes, he's in remarkably good condition, Dr. Martin said, removing his stethoscope. It's quite extraordinary, considering he spent the night outdoors. Temperature dropped to near freezing. Emily sat beside Henry, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. The horse kept him warm, she said quietly. Sierra stayed with him. The doctor raised an eyebrow but made no comment as he noted something on Henry's chart. I'd like to keep him for a few hours for observation and fluids, but he should be able to go home this evening. Michael nodded gratefully. Thank you, doctor. As Dr. Martin left, Sheriff Dawson stepped into the room, removing his hat. How's our young adventurer doing? He'll be fine, Michael answered, thanks to your quick response. And Sierra? The sheriff shook his head in wonder. In their 30 years of law enforcement, I've never seen anything like it. A wild Mustang protecting a child. The BLM folks won't believe it. Speaking of which, Emily said, has anyone contacted Ranger Wilson yet? He should know about this. Dr. Winters is briefing him now. Sheriff Dawson replied, she's quite adamant that this particular mare be identified. And while left alone, Michael's expression hardened slightly. Sierra saved our son's life. If the Bureau has any ideas about rounding her up, easy now. The sheriff interrupted, raising a plating hand. Nobody's talking about roundups, but you have to admit, this is an unusual situation that raises questions. A knock at the door preceded Julia's entrance. Despite the long hours and stress, she carried herself with the same quiet confidence she always displayed. How is he? She asked, moving to Henry's side. The boy didn't look at her directly, but his rocking slowed a sign that those who knew him recognized as comfort. Going to be fine, Emily assured her. Julia smiled. I never doubted it. He's tougher than people give him credit for. She turned to the sheriff. Ranger Wilson wants to speak with all of you when you have a moment. He's got some questions about Sierra. What kind of questions? Michael's tone was guarded. The scientific kind, Julia replied, not the bureaucratic kind. He's as fascinated by this as I am a wild Mustang recognizing a human child after 4 years actively protecting him. It challenges everything we think we know about wild horse behavior. Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat. I should get back to the station, file my report. The whole town's talking about this already. He nodded respectfully to the family, glad everything turned out okay. Real glad. After he left, Julia pulled up a chair beside Henry. I've been thinking about that night, she said quietly. The night Sierra came to your barn. Emily's eyes clouded with the memory the thunderstorm Michael found her by the creek. Her leg caught in that old barbed wire. She was so young, Michael added. Couldn't have been more than 6 months old. Terrified and injured, separated from a herd. Most wild foos in that situation wouldn't have survived, Julia observed, but she had a will to live and she had Henry. They all looked at the boy, who continued to stare out the window, seemingly disengaged from the conversation. Yet somehow, at its very center, he sat with her. Emily recalled hour after hour we couldn't get him to leave the barn. He'd never connect Ed with anything like that before or since. Michael added softly. Julia leaned forward. Henry, she said gently, did you recognize Sierra yesterday? Did you know it was her? The boy didn't answer. Didn't look at her, but his fingers moved slightly, tracing a star shape on his knee. The same distinctive marking that adorned Sierra's forehead. Emily caught the gesture and exchanged a meaningful glance with Julia. He knew she whispered somehow. He knew the question as Julia mused, did he find her, or did she find him? The afternoon sun slanted through the clinic windows as Ranger Wilson entered the room. Unlike the stereotypical, stern government official, Wilson was a thoughtful man in his early 40s with an obvious passion for the wild horses under his protection. Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Patterson. He greeted them with a respectful nod. Dr. Winters has filled me in on the extraordinary circumstances of Henry's rescue. He glanced at the boy with undisguised curiosity. How's he doing? He'll be fine. Emily answered. Thanks to Sierra. Wilson pulled up a chair. That's actually what I wanted to discuss with you, this Mustang. Sierra has demonstrated behavior that contradicts everything we understand about wild horses, especially those who've returned to natural herds after human contact. She remembered Michael stated simply, exactly. Wilson agreed, and that's what fascinates me. Most rehabilitated FS once returned to the wild revert completely to natural behaviors. They don't form lasting attachments to humans, and they certainly don't seek them out years later. Julia interjected, unless the bond was exceptional. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. The Thunder Basin herd ranges about 20 m from where Henry was found. For Sierra to have been in that area, either by coincidence or intent. It wasn't coincidence, Emily said firmly. She protected him all night. She chose to stay with him. That's precisely my point, Wilson replied. This challenges our understanding of Mustang cognition and emotional memory. I'd like your permission to document this case for our research database. Michael's expression remained guarded. As long as it doesn't put Sierra at risk. She belongs with her. I agree, completely, Wilson assured him. In fact, I'd like to propose something a bit unorthodox with your permission and Dr. Winters' assistance. I'd like to set up a few trail cameras in the area where Henry was found. If Sierra returns to that spot, you think she might? Emily asked. Wilson exchanged glances with Julia. I honestly don't know. But if she formed this kind of bond with Henry strong enough to overcome her wild instincts years later, it's possible she might return to the area, Julia added gently. It could help us understand what happened, and maybe she hesitated. Maybe it would help Henry too at the sound of his name. Henry turned from the window, his gaze not quite meeting Julia's but clearly focused in her direction. He made a soft humming sound, the noise he often made when he was processing something important. Michael and Emily shared a look, years of unspoken communication passing between them. All right, Michael finally said, but we want to be informed about everything. No decisions about Sierra without consulting us first. Wilson smiled. I wouldn't have it any other way. 3 days later, the Pattersons' kitchen table was covered with old photo albums and veterinary records. Julia sipped her coffee as Emily turned the pages of a worn leather-bound book. Here, Emily said, pointing to a faded photograph. This is from the day we released her. The picture showed a much younger Henry standing beside a gang foe with a distinctive star marking. The child wasn't looking at the camera, but his hand rested on the young horse's neck. With unmistakable gentleness, 2 weeks, Michael said, joining them at the table. That's all we had her. But Henry spent every moment he could in that barn. Julia studied the photograph. That was a turning point for him, wasn't it? Emily nodded. Before Sierra, he'd never shown interest in connecting with anyone outside our immediate family. But with her, she trailed off, emotion coloring her voice. He found a kindred spirit. Michael finished. Julia carefully turned back several pages in the album. Tell me again about the night you found her. Michael's expression grew distant with the memory. It was during that big thunderstorm in April 4 years back. The creek had flooded, and I was checking the lower pasture fence line, found her trapped against a fallen tree. Her back leg tangled in some old barbed wire. She was exhausted from fighting it, half drowned. Most wild horses would have panicked when you approached. Julia observed she did. At first, Michael acknowledged, but she was too weak to put up much of a fight. I managed to get the wire cutters from my truck and free her leg. Expected her to bolt the minute she was loose, injured or not, but she didn't. Emily added, she just stood there trembling. Good, and put weight on that leg, so you brought her back to your barn? Julia prompted. Michael nodded. Didn't seem right to leave her. Called you the next morning, and Henry? Julia asked, when did he first interact with her? Emily smiled softly at the memory. Almost immediately. It was the strangest thing. We've always had to be so careful about introducing Henry to new situations, new people. But with Sierra, she shook her head in wonder. He just walked right into the barn and sat down in the straw beside her. No fear, no hesitation. And she accepted him. Julia mused. More than accepted. Michael corrected. She seemed to understand something about him that even we didn't. When he would rock or hum, she'd just stand there completely calm. Sometimes she'd make this soft nickering sound, and he'd stop rocking and listen. Julia made a note in her small notebook, and during the 2 weeks of her rehabilitation, Henry spent exceptional amounts of time with her. Emily nodded. We practically had to drag him out of the barn for meals and bed. He'd sit beside her for hours, sometimes reading aloud from his books, which he never did around other people, or just being still together. The communication wasn't one-sided either. Michael added, SI would respond to him if he made certain sounds. She'd come to the stall door. If he seemed distressed, she'd nuzzle him until he calmed. Then when her leg healed and it was time to release her back to the wild. Julia continued. How did Henry react? Pain flickered across Emily's features. That was difficult. He didn't understand why she had to leave. It was the closest he's ever come to a full meltdown. He stood at the fence for hours after we released her. Michael recalled quietly, just watching the hills where she disappeared. Wouldn't come inside until well after dark, and afterward, Julia pressed gently. He regressed. Emily admitted, stopped. The little bits of vocalization he'd started with Sierra withdrew. Again, the school psychologist said it was like he'd built this special bridge of communication with the FO. And when she left, the bridge collapsed. Julia finished softly. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall and the occasional turning of album. Pages outside the golden light of late afternoon painted the hills surrounding the Pattersons' modest ranch. I've been theoretical, Julia finally said. But what you're describing, this mutual communication, this bond, it's exceptional even for domesticated horses, let alone a wild Mustang foe. And the fact that Sierra recognized Henry after all these years. The back door opened and Henry came in from the yard shadow, the family's border collie trotting at his heels. The boy moved to the refrigerator and carefully selected an apple from the fruit drawer. His afternoon routine unchanged by the dramatic events of the past few days. Henry, Julia said gently, do you remember Sierra? The horse from the canyon. The boy didn't respond directly, but his fingers traced that same star pattern on the apple skin before he took a bite. Emily swallowed hard. He does. He remembers the ringing phone. Interrupted the moment Michael answered it, his expression shifting from curiosity to intensity as he listened. "Weck be right there," he said, before hanging up. "What is it?" Emily asked that was Ranger Wilson. Michael replied, already reaching for his jacket. One of the trail cameras picked something up. Sierra's back. The broken Pine Canyon road was rough enough in daylight, but as dusk settled over the mountains, the drive became increasingly challenging. Michael's old truck bounced over ruts and Rock's headlights, illuminating the narrow path ahead in the back seat. Henry sat quietly between Emily and Julia, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. Wilson said she appeared about an hour ago. Michael explained over his shoulder. Just walked right up to the area where we found Henry and stood there. Is she still there? Emily asked as of 20 minutes ago. Yes. Michael confirmed he hasn't approached her, just observed from a distance. Julia watched Henry carefully. The boy showed no outward signs of excitement or anticipation, but she noticed his hands had stopped their usual fidgeting. Henry, she said softly, we're going to see if Sierra is still at the canyon. Is that okay? He didn't answer, but he turned slightly toward her, voice acknowledgement of a sort. They spotted Ranger Wilson's green Bureau of Land Management truck parked at the overlook. The ranger himself stood a few yards away, binoculars raised as they pulled alongside. He lowered the glasses and approached their vehicle. She's still there, he confirmed in a hushed tone. Hasn't moved from that spot in over an hour. It's like she's waiting for something. Michael cut the engine and they all climbed out carefully. Henry remained close to Emily, one hand clutching her jacket. Can we approach Julia? Asked Wilson, nodded slowly. I've been observing her body language. She's alert but not frightened, just expectant. The group made their way carefully to the ridge edge. The last light of day cast long shadows across the canyon floor, but Sierra's chestnut coat was still visible against the rocks. She stood in almost exactly the same spot where they had found her with Henry, her head raised toward the ridge where they now stood. She came back, Emily whispered in amazement. This is unprecedented behavior for a wild Mustang, Wilson remarked quietly. They don't form these kinds of attachments, especially not after returning to a herd. Julia studied the May through her own binoculars. She's in excellent condition, strong, healthy. She's clearly thriving in the wild, yet she chose to return to this specific location. Michael turned to Henry, who stood slightly apart from the adults, his eyes fixed on the distant figure of Sierra's son. He said gently, Do you want to go down there for a moment? No one moved or spoke. Then, to everyone's surprise, Henry took a deliberate step forward and nodded a clear, intentional response. Emily's breath caught. He wants to see her. Wilson looked concerned. I'm not sure that's advisable. She's still a wild animal regardless of your history with her. Sierra protected him before. Michael said firmly, She won't hurt him now, I'll go with him. Julia offered, I've worked with her before, and I know the signs if she becomes agitated. Wilson hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. All right, but at the first sign of distress from either of them, you bring him back up immediately. Julia agreed, and with careful steps she and Henry began making their way down the rocky path toward the canyon floor. Michael and Emily watched anxiously from above, their hearts in their throats, as their son descended toward the wild Mustang. Sierra remained motionless as they approached, her ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as she caught their scent on the evening breeze. When they were about 30 feet away, Julia stopped and placed a gentle hand on Henry's shoulder. Let's wait here a moment, she suggested softly. Let her see you. Let her decide. Henry stood still beside Julia, making no attempt to move closer or call out, but his focus on the Mare was absolute, a level of attention he rarely gave anything or anyone for a long moment. Nothing happened. The canyon was silent except for the whisper of wind through the rocks and the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night. Then, with deliberate grace, Sierra took a step forward. Then another. Her movements were cautious but purposeful. As she approached, Julia felt Henry's shoulder relax under her hand. The boy's breathing changed deeper, calmer. Sierra stopped about 10 feet away, her gaze fixed on Henry's face with an intensity that spoke of recognition, beyond explanation. She knows you, Julia whispered. She remembers slowly. Henry raised his hand palm outward, the same gesture he had made 4 years ago when the frightened foe had first allowed him to touch her. Sierra stretched her neck forward, nostrils flaring as she scented him. Then, with a soft nicker that echoed off the canyon walls, she closed the distance between them and gently pressed her muzzle into Henry's palm. The canyon walls glowed, amber in the fading light, as Henry stood motionless, his small hand resting against Sierra's muzzle from the ridge above. Michael and Emily watched in silent wonder, their fingers intertwined so tightly they could feel each other's pulse beside them. "Ranger." Wilson lowered his binoculars, his professional detachment momentarily forgotten. "I've worked with wild horses for 15 years, he murmured. "Never seen anything like this below." Julia maintained a respectful distance, allowing Henry and Sierra their moment of reconnection. The wild May's body language had transformed completely. Her head, lowered ears, relaxed, one hind leg cocked in a posture of complete ease. Henry's usual rocking had ceased entirely. He stood with a stillness that matched Sierra's, their communication occurring on a level beyond words. "Should we go down there?" Emily whispered, torn between concern and not wanting to interrupt the extraordinary moment. Michael squeezed her hand. "Julia's with him. Let's give them time in the canyon." Henry slowly moved his hand from Sierra's muzzle to her neck, his touch a featherlight. The Mustang remained, perfectly still, allowing the contact that no wild horse should tolerate. Julia watched in professional amazement and personal awe. In all her years of veterinary work, she'd never witnessed such a bond between a wild animal and a human being, especially one renewed after years of separation. "Henry," she said softly after several minutes had passed. "It's getting dark. We should head back up soon." The boy gave no indication he'd heard her, but Sierra's ears flicked toward the sound of Julia's voice. The mare took a single step back, maintaining eye contact with Henry. Then, to Julia's astonishment, Sierra gently nudged Henry's shoulder, turning him in the direction of the path back up to the ridge she's encouraging him to go. Julia realized aloud. She understands Henry allowed himself to be guided, taking a few steps toward the path. He paused, looking back at Sierra, his hand reaching out once more. The mare approached again, touching her muzzle briefly to his palm, before backing away with deliberate steps. Julia gently placed her hand on Henry's shoulder. "She knows we need to go home, Henry, and she needs to return to her herd." Henry's fingers traced the star pattern in the air, his silent acknowledgement of Sierra's marking before he turned and allowed Julia to lead him back up the path behind them. Sierra remained, watching her powerful silhouette framed against the darkening canyon wall as they rejoined the others on the ridge. Emily immediately knelt to check on Henry. "Are you okay, sweetie?" The boy's expression remained unchanged, but there was a new calmness about him that she hadn't seen in years that was remarkable. Ranger Wilson said, his voice hushed with respect, the way she recognized him, the way she interacted. "I've never witnessed that level of cognitive recognition in a wild Mustang." Michael's attention remained fixed on the canyon below, where Sierra still stood watching them. "Will she be safe out there alone?" Wilson followed his gaze. "She's not alone. The Thunder Basin, her ranges throughout this area, she'll likely rejoin them before morning." He hesitated, but this location, it seems to hold significance for her now. "I wouldn't be surprised if she returns." As if in confirmation of Wilson's words, Sierra finally turned and moved away from her observation, point cantering gracefully into the deepening shadows of the canyon. "Can we come back tomorrow?" Emily asked quietly. Wilson exchanged glances with Julia. "I think that would be fine, but we should establish some protocols for Henry's safety and for Sierra's well-being." The drive back to the Patteron Ranch was filled with a thoughtful silence, broken only when Henry unexpectedly hummed a soft rhythmic sound, the same gentle cadence he had used years ago when sitting with the injured foe in their barn. Emily's eyes filled with tears at the sound. "He's coming back to us," she whispered to Michael, just like she came back to him the next morning. The story of Henry and Sierra had spread throughout Redwood Creek. The small-town diner buzzed with conversation as locals shared and embellished the tale of the wild Mustang who had protected a lost child. "Heard the boy spent the whole night with that wild horse standing guard," said Frank Murray, the hardware store owner, between sips of coffee, like something out of a storybook. "Patterson boy, right?" asked Ellie from behind the counter. The quiet one. Tom Baker, who'd been part of the search party, nodded. Henry doesn't talk much, but smart as a whip, according to his teacher. And you're saying this horse actually remembered him from years? Hego. Ellie shook her head in disbelief. Sounds far-fetched to me. Dr. Winters confirmed it. Tom insisted same Mustang that rehabilitated 4 years back as a star marking. Right here. He touched his forehead clear as day. The dyno door opened and conversations momentarily paused as Julia entered. She nodded acknowledgments to the curious faces before taking a seat at the counter. Coffee in black, she ordered, aware of the expectant silence. Ellie placed a steaming mug before her, so she ventured, "Is it true? About the Patterson boy and the wild horse?" Julia took a deliberate sip before answering. Henry was found safe. Yes, and a Mustang Mare was with him. But was it the same one Frank pressed, the one they helped years back? Julia met his gaze evenly. Yes, it was Sierra. The diner erupted in murmurs of amazement. Questions flew fast and furious until Julia raised a hand for quiet look. She said firmly, "This is an extraordinary situation, but it's also a private matter for the Patterson family. Henry is recovering, and Sierra's back in the wild where she belongs. That's all anyone needs to know right now." "But how did she recognize him after all this time?" someone asked. "That's what I don't understand." Julia considered her answer carefully. Animals remember more than we give them credit for. Especially horses, they form bonds based on trust and EXP experience. She paused. Henry showed Sierra kindness when she was vulnerable. Perhaps she was returning that kindness. The explanation seemed to satisfy. Most of the curious crowd and conversations gradually shifted to other topics. Julia finished her coffee in relative peace, though she was acutely aware of sidelong glances and whispered discussions as she paid her bill. Ellie leaned across the counter. "Tell the Pattersons we're all real glad their boy is safe," she said sincerely. "Whatever happened out there with that horse, it's a blessing." Julia nodded appreciatively. "I'll tell them outside." She paused on the sidewalk, taking in the quiet morning activity of Redwood Creek. The small mountain town moved at its own unhurried pace, a shopkeeper sweeping his front step, the mail carrier making her rounds, a couple of old-timers playing checkers in front of the barber shop, yet beneath the ordinary routine. Julia sensed a current of excitement. The story of Henry and Sierra had touched something in the community, a reminder that there were still mysteries in this world, still connections that defied easy explanation. Her phone buzzed, with a text from Michael Henry asking to go back to Canyon, okay, to come by around 10. Julia smiled and texted back agreement, whatever was happening between the boy and the wild Mustang. It was far from over at the Patterson Ranch. Preparations for the Canyon visit were underway. Emily packed a small cooler with water and snacks, while Michael reviewed topographical maps with Ranger Wilson, who had arrived earlier to accompany them. The trail cameras captured her again this morning. Wilson reported showing them images on his tablet. She returned just after dawn and spent about an hour in the same location waiting. Emily said softly from across the room. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "That's how it appears," which frankly challenges everything we understand about wild Mustang behavior. They're social animals within their herds, but they don't typically form these kinds of sustained attachments to humans. Henry isn't typical either, Michael pointed out, watching his son methodically pack his backpack across the room. The boy had selected several books, his drawing pad, and a small wooden horse figure, the items he considered essential for the day's journey. A car pulled into the driveway, and Julia joined them moments later, bringing with her a sense of null confidence that the Peasons had come to rely on. "How is he this morning?" she asked, nodding toward Henry. "Different." Emily replied, "More present. He actually asked to go back. Used his communication board to spell out Sierra and go." Julia's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's significant progress." "It's more than progress," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "He hasn't used his board voluntarily in months." The drive to Broken Pine Canyon was easier in daylight, though the road remained challenging. 2 vehicles made the journey, Michael driving the family truck with Emily and Henry, while Julia rode with Ranger Wilson in his BLM vehicle. They parked at the now familiar overlook and gathered their supplies for the descent into the canyon. "I've asked that this area be temporarily restricted," Wilson informed them as they prepared to hike down no other visitors until, "We better understand what's happening here. It's better for both Henry and Sierra." Michael nodded gratefully. "We appreciate that." As they made their way down the rocky path, Henry moved with surprising confidence, occasionally pausing to look ahead. Expectantly at the bottom, they set up a small sheltered area with folding chairs and a tarp for shade. The spot where Sierra had been standing earlier was empty, but the trail cameras remained. "Vigilant now we wait," Julia said, settling into a chair. Beside Henry, she might not come back immediately, but Henry seemed unconcerned by the Mustang's absence. He sat cross-legged on the ground, opened his drawing pad, and began to sketch with focused attention, something the adults had rarely seen him do outside the structured environment of his therapy sessions. Emily watched him with quiet wonder. "Look at how steady his hands are," she whispered to Michael. An hour passed. Wilson checked the trail cameras, confirming there had been no new sightings of Sierra. Since early morning, the adults conversed in low tones about wild horse behavior and conservation efforts, careful not to disturb Henry's concentration on his drawing. Then, without warning, Henry stopped drawing and looked up. His body became completely still, his attention fixed on the eastern end of the canyon. The adults followed his gaze but saw nothing. "What is it, Henry?" Emily asked gently. The boy didn't respond, but his focus remained unwavering, then almost imperceptibly. At first, the sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, soft measured steps growing gradually louder. "She's coming," Julia said. Rising slowly from her chair, Sierra appeared around a bend in the canyon, her chestnut coat gleaming in the midday sun. She moved with the fluid grace of a wild thing, powerful and self-possessed, but there was purpose in her approach. Not the casual wandering of a Mustang grazing, but the deliberate journey of one with a destination firmly in mind. Henry stood, his drawing pad falling forgotten to the ground. The page revealed what had occupied him for the past hour. A surprisingly detailed sketch of Sierra's head, the star marking on her forehead rendered with particular care. The Mustang stopped about 20 yards away, assessing the group of humans. Her ears flicked forward in recognition when she spotted Henry, but she made no immediate move to approach. "She's being cautious because there are more of us today," Julia explained quietly. "It's normal behavior." Henry took a small step forward, then looked back at his parents with an expression they rarely saw, a silent request for permission. "It's okay," Emily said, though her voice trembled slightly. "But stay where we can see you," with deliberate steps. Henry moved toward Sierra, stopping halfway between the mayor and the adults. He waited, patient in a way that seemed utterly at odds with his usual restless energy. Sierra poured the ground, once then took several steps forward, closing the distance between them. When she reached Henry, she lowered her head until they were eye, a gesture of extraordinary trust from a wild horse. "My God," Wilson breathed, "I've never seen." "Ish," Julia cautioned, though her own amazement was evident. Henry raised his hand slowly and placed it on Sierra's cheek. The Mustang leaned into his touch, and for a brief moment, it was impossible to tell who was more at peace, the boy or the horse. Then Henry did something that left the watching adults stunned. He turned toward his parents and made a clear gesture with his free hand. The sign for "come." Emily's hand flew to her mouth. Michael blinked rapidly against unexpected tears. Their son, who so often retreated from connection, was inviting them to join him. "Go," Julia encouraged softly. "Move slowly, but go with careful steps." Michael and Emily approached. Sierra watched them come, her body tensing slightly, but her position beside Hen unwavering. "It's okay, girl," Michael murmured. "Remember us." Sierra's ears flicked toward the sound of his voice. She raised her head slightly, nostrils flaring as she scented him. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she extended her muzzle toward him in a gesture of recognition. "She knows you too," Julia called softly from where she and Wilson remained, observing the entire family. Emily extended her hand cautiously, following Henry's example. Sierra regarded her for a moment before allowing the touch. "Thank you," Emily whispered to the mayor, her voice breaking. "Thank you for protecting him for nearly an hour." The remarkable communion continued. Henry sat on the ground beside Sierra occasionally, Reaching up to touch her leg or shoulder, the Mustang remained beside him, sometimes grazing nearby, but never moving more than a few yards away. Wilson documented everything with quiet professionalism, though his expression betrayed his awe. "This defies everything in the textbooks," he confided to Julia. "Wild Mustangs who've returned to herds don't behave this way with humans. They just don't." "Perhaps we need new textbooks," Julia suggested. "Or perhaps we need to recognize that there are relationships that transcend our understanding." The afternoon light began to soften, signaling the approaching end of their visit. Emily gently touched Henrik's shoulder. "It's time to go home, sweetie. We can come back tomorrow for a moment." Henry's body tensed in. "Resistance, then?" Sierra nickered softly and nudged his back once again, seeming to understand what was required the boy. Rose obediently, though his reluctance was evident in every movement. Henry Michael said, an idea forming. "Would you like to take a picture with Sierra to keep until we come back?" The boy nodded, a clear, purposeful response that sent another wave of emotion through his parents. Emily quickly retrieved her phone, and Michael positioned himself to take the photo stand next to her. "Henry," he directed gently, but Henry had his own idea. Instead of standing for a formal picture, he sat cross-legged on the ground beside Sierra's front legs. After a moment's hesitation, the mare lowered herself to a resting position beside him. Their bodies nearly touching, Michael captured the image, a wild Mustang at rest beside a small boy, both gazing toward the camera with expressions of complete serenity. It was a photograph that would eventually find its way into frames throughout their home, but in that moment it was simply a testament to the extraordinary bond they were witnessing. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the canyon floor, it was time to leave. Henry rose reluctantly, his hand lingering on Sierra's shoulder. The mare stood as well, shaking her man as if preparing for their departure. "We'll come back, Henry. Emily promised Sierra will be here." The boy nodded, and with one final touch to the mare's muzzle, he turned and walked back toward his parent. Sierra remained where she was, watching as the group gathered their belongings and began the climb back up to the ridge halfway up the path. Henry stopped and looked back. Sia still stood in the same spot, her gaze fixed on him. The boy raised his hand in a small wave, a gesture so normal for most children, yet so remarkable for Henry that Emily had to bite her lip to keep from crying. And then, most amazing of all, Sierra raised her right foreleg and poured the air once before setting it down again, a gesture that mirrored Henry's farewell in a way that could not be coincidence. "Did you see that?" Michael whispered. Ranger Wilson nodded, speechless for once. As they reached their vehicles, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, and the canyon below Sierra finally turned and caned away, disappearing into the shadows of her wild domain. But they all knew without any doubt that she would return, and so would they. The bond between a silent boy and a wild Mustang had only just begun to reveal its depth and power in the days to come. It would change not only Henry's life, but touch everyone who witnessed it in ways none of them could yet imagine. The Patterson kitchen table had become command central. Maps, not books, photographs, and coffee mugs cluttered its worn wooden surface as Michael, Emily, Julia, and Ranger Wilson reviewed the data from 2 weeks of daily visits to the canyon. "Her appearances are becoming more predictable," Wilson noted, pointing to a chart he'd compiled. "Almost always between 10 and 11. In the morning, she stays for approximately 3 hours, then leaves, presumably to rejoin her herd, and she's always waiting in when we arrive." Emily added, shuffling through a stack of photographs. Each image showed Sierra in various interactions with Henry, standing beside him as he read from a book, watching attentively as he arranged rocks in patterns, or simply resting nearby as he sat, drawing. "What I find most remarkable," Julia said, "is how their interactions have evolved. Initially, it was all about touch and proximity. Now there's a communication system developing, head gestures." Sierra responds, "She nickered yesterday when he showed her his drawing, almost like she was commenting on it." And Henrik's responses, Wilson asked, his scientific interest evident. Emily and Michael exchanged glances. "He's different," Michael said carefully, "more connected. He initiated breakfast conversation this morning, pointed to what he wanted instead of waiting for us to anticipate his needs. His teacher called yesterday," Emily added, "said he's showing increased engagement in class. Made eye contact with her twice during reading time." Julia nodded. These are significant developments. The question remains, Wilson said, tapping his pen against his notebook. What happens long term? Sierra is wild. She belongs with her herd. And while this relationship is extraordinary, it's not sustainable in its current form. Indefinitely, a heavy silence fell over the kitchen. It was the question they'd all been avoiding. What are you suggesting? Michael asked, an edge creeping into his voice. Wilson chose his words carefully. I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm simply acknowledging that we're in uncharted territory. Sierra is demonstrating behavior so unusual for a wild Mustang that it challenges our entire understanding of these animals, and the effect on Henry is equally remarkable. We can't just end it, Emily said, her protective instinct flaring. No one's talking about ending anything, Julia interjected gently. But Wilson has a point we need to consider. Winter will come to these mountains. Eventually the herds will migrate to lower elevations. What happens? Then the back door opened, saving them from having to address the question immediately. Henry entered, followed by his shadow. For the day, Beth Patterson, Michael's sister, who had arrived from Portland the previous week after hearing about the remarkable events. How was the garden? Emily asked quickly. Gathering the papers from the table, productive, Beth replied, hanging up her sun hat. Henry helped me harvest the tomatoes. Didn't you, buddy? The boy didn't respond verbally, but he placed a perfectly ripe tomato on the table with obvious pride. That's a good one, Michael said, examining it with exaggerated care. Just right for sandwiches. Henry nodded, then moved to the refrigerator where the photograph with Sierra was now prominently displayed. He touched it gently, a ritual he performed multiple times daily. We're going tomorrow, Emily assured him. First thing in the morning, Beth watched the exchange with the curious eyes of someone still trying to understand a complex situation. Initially skeptical about the whole story, she had insisted on accompanying them to the canyon the previous day. Seeing Henry with Sierra had transformed her doubt into wonder. I still can't believe it, she said quietly to the adults as Henry left the room. A wild horse. Remembering him after all these years, coming back day after day. It's like something from a storybook, yet it's happening. Wilson confirmed, we've documented every interaction. The scientific implications are significant. Forget science for a minute, Beth said, taking a seat at the table. What about Henry? What happens when the novelty wears off for this horse? Michael's expression hardened. It's not novelty. Sierra's not a pet coming around for treats. This is something deeper. I didn't mean Beth. Backpedal. It's a fair question, Julia interrupted diplomatically, but I don't think we're dealing with novelty or curiosity on Sierra. This behavior has been consistent and purposeful. She recognizes Henry specifically. She adjusts her responses. To his needs, there's intentionality behind her actions that goes beyond animal curiosity. Beth nodded properly, chastised. I just worry about him getting hurt. You all remember what happened when she was released the first time. The reminder sobered them all. Henry's regression after C's departure 4 years ago had been pronounced withdrawal, increased repetitive behaviors, refusal to engage. That's precisely why we need to consider next steps carefully, Wilson said. For both Henry's well-being and Sierra's, the next morning dawned clear and crisp. The first hints of autumn touching the aspen leaves with gold. The drive to Broken Pine Canyon had become routine, but the anticipation never diminished today. However, something was different. Henry sat unusually still in the back seat, clutching his backpack tightly. You okay, buddy? Michael asked, catching his son's eye in the rearview mirror. Henry nodded, but his fingers worked the straps of his backpack anxiously when they arrived at the overlook. Another vehicle was already parked there, an unfamiliar black SUV with government plates. Michael frowned as he pulled alongside. Were we expecting company? He asked Wilson, who had arrived earlier to check the trail cameras. The ranger looked uncomfortable. My supervisor asked to observe today standard protocol for unusual wildlife interactions. A middle-aged man in a crisp BLM uniform approached as they exited their vehicle. Frank Donovan, he introduced himself with a firm handshake. Regional wildlife manager. I've heard remarkable things about your situation here. It's not a situation, Michael corrected stiffly. It's a relationship. Donovan raised an eyebrow but didn't argue the point. His gaze shifted to Henry. who stood close to Emily, unusually tense. "This must be the young man I've heard so much about. Hello there, son." Henry didn't acknowledge the greeting, his attention fixed on the path leading down to the canyon. "He's eager to see." Sierra explained, joining them from her truck. "We should head down." The descent felt different with Donovan's official presence. The easy camaraderie of previous visits had been replaced by a tension that even Henry seemed to sense, staying unusually close to his parents. At the canyon floor, they set up their now familiar spot chairs, shade-top small cooler. Henry immediately took out his drawing pad but didn't open it instead, scanning the sea cannon expectantly. "So tell me," Donovan said, settling into stance of professional assessment, "how predictable are these encounters? Does the Mustang always appear?" Sierra. Emily corrected. Her name is Sierra. "And yes, she's been consistent in her appearances." Donovan nodded, making a note in his small notebook. "And you say she was rehabilitated by your family some years ago?" 4 years. Michael confirmed. "She was injured, separated from her herd. We cared for her until she was strong enough to be released. And during that time, your son formed an attachment. They formed a connection." Julia interjected. It was mutual. Anyone who observed them could see that Donovan's skepticism was subtle, but unmistakable. Wild horses don't typically form lasting attachments to humans. Even those raised in captivity often revert to natural behaviors. "When returned to the wild, with all due respect," Wilson said, "Sierra is challenging our existing understanding of Mustang behavior. That's why I've been documenting these interactions so carefully." Further discussion was halted by Henry's sudden alertness. He stood, drawing pad falling to the ground, his attention fixed on the eastern end of the canyon. The familiar sound of hoofbeats echoed off the rock walls, right on schedule. Julia murmured. Sierra appeared around the bend, her pace quickening when she spotted the gathering, but she pulled up short, her body language instantly changing when she noticed the unfamiliar figure of Donovan. Her ears went back, nostrils flaring as she assessed the new human. "She's nervous," Julia observed quietly. "The new person is making her cautious." Henry took a step forward, then another, moving with deliberate calm. He made a soft clicking sound, the same one Julia had taught him years ago when working with the injured FO. Sierra's ears flicked forward. At the familiar sound, she remained wary, but her focus shifted entirely to Henry. With careful steps, she approached, her body relaxing incrementally as she drew closer to the boy. Even Donovan couldn't hide his amazement as the wild Mustang lowered her head to Henry's level, allowing him to touch her muzzle. Extraordinary. He breathed. For the next hour, they observed the now familiar interaction between boy and horse. Henry sat cross-legged on the ground, Sierra standing guard beside him, or occasionally grazing nearby, never moving more than a few yards away. The Mustang remained alert to Donovan's presence, but seemed to have assessed him as non-threatening. "What do they do exactly?" Donovan asked in a low voice. "Just be together sometimes," Julia replied. "Other times Henry reads to her or draws. Yesterday, he brought small rocks and arranged them in patterns." Sierra watched the entire time, completely engaged. "It's communication," Emily added. "Not the way we think of it, but a form of connection that works for both of them." As if to demonstrate, Henry suddenly reached into his backpack and withdrew a small object, which he held up for Sierra to see. It was the carved wooden horse figure he kept on his bedside table, a gift from his grandfather, years ago. Sierra lowered her head to inspect the offering, her breath stirring Henry's hair as she sniffed the carved figure. Then, to everyone's amazement, Henry spoke a single word, barely audible, but unmistakable: "horse." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Michael froze, hardly daring to believe what he'd heard in the profound silence that followed. Henry spoke again, touching Sierra's leg. "Horse, did he just?" Donovan began. "Yes," Julia confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "That's the first word he's spoken aloud in nearly 3 years." Sierra nickered softly in response, as if acknowledging the monumental nature of the moment. Henry smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his usually solemn features. Emily was crying openly now, Michael's arm tight around her shoulders, What they were witnessing transcended the already extraordinary bond between boy and Mustang. It was a breakthrough that countless therapy sessions and interventions had failed to achieve. This changes things. Donovan said quietly to Wilson. The skepticism had vanished from his demeanor, replaced by a thoughtful consideration. Documentation is no longer adequate. We need a more comprehensive approach to understand what's happening here. Wilson nodded. I've been saying that this isn't just unusual animal behavior, it's a legitimate therapeutic relationship. As the morning stretched into afternoon, more small miracles unfolded. Henry didn't speak again, but his engagement was on a level his parents had never witnessed. He guided Sierra through a series of simple interactions. Touching her leg meant she should raise her hoof, a gesture toward the ground prompted her to lower her head. It was a language they had developed together, intuitive and effective. He's teaching her, Julia observed, but she's also teaching him. Donovan took careful notes, occasionally asking quiet questions, but mostly observing with increasing wonder. When it was finally time to leave, he stepped aside with Wilson. Their conversation, intense but too low to overhear. Henry's goodbye to Sierra had become a ritual of its own. He stood before her, placed both hands on her cheeks, and leaned his forehead briefly against hers. The Mustang remained perfectly still, accepting the contact. With remarkable patience for a wild animal. Then she stepped back, shook her man, and waited until Henry turned to leave before she too departed. As they climbed back to the vehicles, Donovan approached Michael and Emily. I admit I was skeptical when I arrived today, he said frankly. Wild horse behavior is my specialty, and what Wilson described seemed improbable. But having witnessed it myself, he paused, choosing his words carefully. This is something unique, something important, not just for your son, but potentially for our understanding of these animals. What are you suggesting? Michael asked cautiously. I'd like to bring in Dr. Meredith Chase from UC Davis. She specializes in EON cognition and behavior. With your permission, of course. Michael and Emily exchanged glances, their silent communication, born of years parenting together, as long as it doesn't disrupt Henry's time with Sierra. Emily stipulated. Of course. Donovan agreed. Observation only. And perhaps he hesitated. Perhaps we should discuss longer-term arrangements. Winter's coming. The herds will move if this relationship is as beneficial as it appears. He left the thought unfinished, but its implications hung in the air. What had begun as an extraordinary rescue was evolving into something none of them had anticipated. Something with the potential to change not just Henry's life, but perhaps many others. That evening, as Emily tucked Henry into bed, she noticed the wooden horse figure placed carefully on his pillow. Did you have a good day with Sierra? She asked, smoothing his hair. Henry nodded, then pointed to the figure and whispered so softly she almost missed it. Horse friend. 2 simple words, but they contained a world of meaning. Emily kissed his forehead too, overcome to speak. Downstairs, she found Michael and Julia at the kitchen table, heads bent over a stack of documents. What's all this? She asked, wiping away the lingering tears of joy. Michael looked up, his expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. Options, he said, for the future, for Henry and Sierra. A future that just weeks ago none of them could have imagined. A future shaped by the remarkable bond between a silent child and a wild Mustang, who had somehow found her way back to him when he needed her most. Autumn painted the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold as Dr. Meredith Chase set up her equipment at the canyon, a respected authority in equine behavior from UC Davis. She brought a scientific rigor to the observations that complemented Ranger Wilson's documentation. Camera traps with motion sensors, directional microphones, and thermal imaging devices were now positioned strategically throughout the area. Is all this really necessary? Michael asked, watching her adjust a camera lens. We don't want to frighten Sierra. Dr. Chase straightened, pushing her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose. The equipment is unobtrusive. Most of it will run automatically, minimizing human interference. Her tone was brisk, but not unkind. What's happening here is unprecedented. Mr. Patterson, if we're going to understand it, truly understand it, we need data. Henry sat nearby, seemingly oblivious to the activity around him. Over the past month, his progress had continued to astonish everyone, although his speech remained limited, single-word words. Occasionally, 2-word phrases. His engagement with the world had expanded dramatically. His teacher reported improved eye contact, increased participation in classroom activities, and even brief social interactions with classmates. Sierra did this. Emily had told his behavioral therapist during their last session. She reached him in a way none of us could now. Watching her son's relaxed posture as he waited for Sierra's arrival, Emily felt a profound gratitude mixed with lingering anxiety. The question of what would happen when winter forced the wild herds to migrate still loomed over them all. Dr. Chase joined her, clipboard in hand. "You know," she said, following Emily's gaze to Henry, "I've studied equine-human interactions for 15 years, therapy horses, working relationships, long-term bonds between riders and their mounts, but I've never documented anything like this. What makes it so different?" Emily asked. "Sierra is genuinely wild," Dr. Chase explained. "Not domesticated, not imprinted on humans from birth. She chose to return to Henry. She continues to choose this relationship daily despite having a herd to return to. That's extraordinary." The familiar sound of hoofbeats signaled Sierra's approach. Henry stood immediately, his entire demeanor changing, more alert, more present. The Mustang appeared around the bend, her pace quickening when she spotted the boy, but she pulled up short. Ears pricked forward in alarm at the unfamiliar equipment scattered around the canyon floor. Dr. Chase had assured them the devices were minimal, but to a wild horse's keen senses they represented unknown threats.